The morning light sliced through the tall courthouse windows like blades of gold. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated in slow motion, drifting above rows of polished wooden benches packed with anxious spectators. Reporters whispered to one another, their cameras resting on their laps like coiled predators waiting to strike. Family members clutched tissues. Police officers stood rigid along the walls, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes scanning every movement in the room. This wasn't just another trial. Everyone felt it. Even the air seemed different, heavier, thicker, charged with something dangerous and unresolved. At the front of the room, the American flag hung perfectly still, its red stripes deep against the pale walls. The judge sat high on his bench, stone-faced, his glasses resting low on his nose as he shuffled through thick stacks of legal documents. His gavel rested beside him, like a weapon he hoped he wouldn't need to use. Across the room sat the defendant. A man in his late 30s, dressed in a neatly pressed navy suit that didn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. His hands trembled faintly beneath the table, fingers rubbing together as if trying to wipe away invisible guilt. His lawyer leaned close, whispering last-minute instructions, but the man barely listened. His eyes were locked on one thing, the side door of the courtroom. That door had become a silent center of attention. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked curious, others looked deeply uncomfortable. A few stared at the floor, clearly wishing they weren't here at all. Then, a low scratching sound echoed from the hallway outside. The courtroom fell completely silent. Not quiet. Silent. Even the ventilation system seemed to fade into the background. The bailiff straightened, stepped forward, and reached for the handle. The metal door creaked open. First came the dog. A large police K9 with jet black fur that shimmered under the courtroom lights. His body was lean, muscular, and controlled, every step deliberate. His paws clicked against the marble floor in a slow, rhythmic pattern that felt louder than gunshots in that moment. His ears were alert, eyes sharp, tail low but steady. This wasn't a pet. This was a trained weapon of law enforcement, disciplined, intelligent, and deadly serious. Behind him walked his handler, uniform crisp, face calm but watchful. His hand rested lightly on the dog's harness, not because he needed control, but because the bond between them was unspoken and absolute. Gasps rippled softly through the gallery. Some people shifted in their seats, others leaned forward, fascinated. But the defendant went pale. His jaw tightened, his breathing quickened, his foot tapped against the floor beneath the table once, twice, then stopped. And then, she appeared. A small figure stepped through the doorway, almost hidden behind her mother's legs. A 3-year-old girl. She wore a bright pink dress with tiny white flowers along the hem. Her hair was tied into 2 messy pigtails, a few loose curls framing her round face. Pink sneakers squeaked softly against the marble as she walked, each step hesitant, unsure, almost nervous. In one hand, she clutched a crumpled stuffed rabbit whose ear dangled sadly to one side. In the other, she held her mother's trembling fingers. Her mother looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, lips pressed thin, shoulders tight with stress that had clearly been building for months. She moved slowly, protectively, as though the entire courtroom might shatter her child if she let go. The little girl's eyes were wide, not scared but deeply observant. She wasn't crying. She wasn't fidgeting. She was studying everything. The tall ceiling, the wooden benches, the jurors, the judge, and finally, the dog. Her step slowed, then stopped. Her tiny hand tightened around her mother's fingers so suddenly that her mother flinched. The courtroom shifted again. Everyone felt it. Something invisible had changed. The child didn't look afraid of the dog. She didn't scream, she didn't hide. Instead, her gaze locked onto him, unblinking. The K9 sat down at his handler's side with perfect obedience, head high, chest steady, eyes forward. But the dog noticed her too. His ears twitched. His breathing changed. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in his posture rippled through his body. The handler felt it immediately. His hand tightened on the harness. From the gallery, someone whispered, "Why did they bring a baby in here?" Another voice replied softly, "She's not just a baby, she's a witness." A witness? The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. The judge leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. "Ma'am," he said calmly to the mother, "please take your seat with your daughter near the front." The mother nodded stiffly and guided the little girl toward the first row. As they walked past the defense table, the child glanced up. For a split second, her eyes met the defendant. His face froze. A flicker of something crossed his expression: fear, guilt, panic, or all three. He looked away quickly. Too quickly. The little girl didn't. She watched him until they passed. Then her attention snapped back to the dog. She stared. Hard. The courtroom grew unbearably tense. The prosecutor cleared his throat, standing slowly. He had prepared carefully for this moment, but now his confidence seemed fragile. "Your Honor," he began, "we have brought the child witness in only briefly to establish comfort and recognition." The judge nodded. "Proceed cautiously," he warned. The mother bent down to her daughter's level, brushing a stray curl from her face. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're safe." But the girl didn't seem concerned with safety. Her eyes never left the dog. The handler shifted his weight, uneasy now. He had worked with K-9 units for over a decade. He'd seen dogs react to criminals, explosives, weapons, and fear. But this, a 3-year-old staring down his dog with such intensity. That was new. The prosecutor stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance. "Hello there," he said gently. "What's your name?" The girl didn't answer. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her breathing quickened. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit tightened. Her mother squeezed her hand reassuringly. "It's okay," she repeated. Then, the child took a small step forward. Her pink sneakers squeaked again. A few jurors leaned forward instinctively. The defendant shifted in his seat, eyes darting toward the exit. The dog remained still, but his tail flicked once. A sharp, controlled movement. The handler felt a chill crawl up his spine. The girl tilted her head. Her brow furrowed like she was trying to remember something important. Something buried deep. Her gaze traveled slowly over the dog's body. His collar, his harness, the faint scar along his muzzle, the steady rise and fall of his chest. The courtroom held its breath. Not a single cough. Not a single whisper. Then, the child's tiny hand slipped free from her mother's grasp. Her arm lifted slowly. Her finger trembled. And she pointed. Directly at the police dog. A murmur erupted instantly, then died as the judge slammed his gavel. "Order in the court." The mother gasped softly, instinctively reaching for her daughter but stopping just short. The child didn't lower her hand. Her eyes were no longer confused. They were certain. The dog's ears perked higher. The handler's heart began to pound. Across the room, the defendant went rigid, his knuckles turning white against the table. The prosecutor felt his pulse hammer in his throat. This wasn't supposed to happen like this. Not now. Not here. Not in front of everyone. The little girl's lips trembled. She opened her mouth. And in that split second, just before she spoke, the entire courtroom seemed to tip toward the edge of something irreversible. A truth no one was ready for. A revelation that could break the trial wide open. A moment that would change everything. And as her voice rose from her tiny chest, the air itself felt like it was about to shatter. The courtroom seemed to exhale at once, a collective intake of breath as if the air itself were waiting for what the little girl might say. The judge adjusted his glasses, trying to maintain composure, but even he felt a strange tension crawling up his spine. He had presided over thousands of cases, some violent, some heartbreaking, but never had a child's presence carried such an electric, almost dangerous weight. The 3-year-old didn't flinch. She stood with her tiny chest forward, pink dress fluttering faintly with the movement. Her stuffed rabbit drooped in one arm, forgotten. Her finger, trembling slightly, remained pointed at the police dog. Her mother crouched beside her, whispering, "It's okay, sweetie, just look at the nice dog." But the girl shook her head, a small but determined gesture. She wasn't scared. She wasn't confused. She was focused. The handler noticed immediately that the dog's posture had shifted. Usually in a courtroom or around civilians, he remained still, almost statuesque. But now his ears twitched, his head tilted slightly toward the girl. There was recognition there, subtle, instinctive, a reaction trained out of most animals, but somehow the dog knew something important, something real. The prosecutor cleared his throat, stepping closer but keeping his distance from both child and dog. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "can you tell me the dog's name?" The child's lips pressed together and she blinked rapidly. She wasn't going to answer that. She didn't care about names. Her gaze remained fixed, unwavering. The jurors shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others sitting rigidly upright. Even seasoned officers looked uneasy, sensing the weight of the moment. The defense attorney, a tall man with a nervous twitch in his left eye, whispered something urgently to his client. The defendant's head snapped up. He looked at the girl, then at the dog, and back to the floor, color draining from his face. His breathing was shallow enough for anyone nearby to notice. "Your Honor," the attorney said quickly, "we request that the child be removed from the courtroom. This is completely inappropriate." The judge raised a hand. "Not yet," he said firmly. His eyes lingered on the girl. There was something in her expression that made him pause, something compelling and unavoidable. "She is not being disruptive. Proceed with caution, but proceed." The mother squeezed her daughter's shoulder gently. "Go ahead, sweetie. You can say it now." The child's brow furrowed. She opened her mouth, paused, then almost imperceptibly whispered, "Bad man." The words were tiny, but in the quiet courtroom they rang out like a bell. A collective shiver went through the room. Jurors exchanged startled glances. Reporters froze mid-note, their pens hovering over notepads. Even the judge leaned back slightly, stunned by the simplicity yet gravity of the statement. The dog's tail flicked sharply. His ears pricked forward. He took a single, calculated step closer to the child's point, as if affirming her declaration. The handler's hand tightened on the harness instinctively, though he said nothing. The defendant's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he jerked upright, panic flashing in his eyes. "Objection!" his lawyer shouted, but the words were hollow in the charged atmosphere. The courtroom had already changed. The moment had already shifted the entire trajectory of the trial. The mother covered her mouth with both hands, a soft gasp escaping. She hadn't realized the words had come out so plainly, so uncontrollably, but her daughter wasn't lying. She wasn't imagining. She had witnessed something, and the truth, raw, unfiltered, had spilled into the room. The prosecutor's hand shook slightly as he adjusted his notes. He cleared his throat again, trying to sound professional. "Can you point to the man you mean?" he asked the child softly. The girl did not hesitate. Her little arm rose again, finger trembling, pointing straight at the defendant. The jurors leaned forward, their expressions a mix of shock, curiosity, and disbelief. The defendant's knees knocked together. His hands gripped the table so hard his knuckles were white. The air between him and the girl felt charged, magnetic, almost like a taut wire ready to snap. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "Order," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he felt the courtroom teetering on the edge of chaos. The handler bent slightly, whispering to the dog, "Easy, boy, stay." But the dog didn't budge. His gaze remained locked on the girl. His instincts, honed for years of detecting danger, locating suspects, and identifying scents, told him this moment was significant. The child's eyes flicked momentarily to her mother, seeking reassurance. Her mother nodded silently. And then, without any prompting, the girl repeated her words, this time louder, firmer. "Bad man." The room fell utterly silent again. No one dared breathe. The weight of a 3-year-old's 2 words pressed down on the walls, the ceiling, the polished floor. The defendant swallowed hard. He tried to look away, but the child's gaze pinned him in place. He shifted in his seat, but his attempts at composure were futile. Every instinct told him something had just gone horribly wrong. The prosecutor swallowed nervously, aware of the magnitude of what was happening. The jury was watching. Every single witness, every officer, every reporter, every family member, they were all witnessing a moment that no one could have anticipated. A moment that would be scrutinized, dissected, and replayed for years. Even the judge, whose gavel had ended countless trials, knew this wasn't a standard proceeding anymore. Something profound had entered the courtroom. something that couldn't be undone. And the child, small but resolute, continued to stare, finger unwavering, lips still slightly parted, eyes wide and unblinking. The entire courtroom waited. For what she would say next. For what the dog would do. For the unraveling of the truth. And in that pregnant silence it was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if the walls had tightened around everyone. The 3-year-old's 2 simple words, "bad man," had shifted the atmosphere, turning procedural formality into raw, palpable tension. Whispers ran like electricity among the jurors, but no one dared speak too loudly. Even the judge's usually measured breath seemed louder in the sudden hush. The defendant's hands trembled on the edge of the table. He tried to pull himself together, straighten his posture, look confident, but the effort was hollow. His eyes darted repeatedly to the child, then to the dog, and then back to the floor. Something in the dog's gaze made him freeze, recognition, accusation, or a silent judgment he could not control. The handler, calm but alert, sensed the same change. Years of training had taught him to read K9 signals, a flick of the tail, a slight shift in stance, a hardened stare. And now the dog was responding to the child, not to the handler, not to the commands, to her. The mother crouched slightly, keeping a protective hand near her daughter. She whispered softly, "It's okay, honey, just tell them what you know." But the girl shook her head. She wasn't hesitant. She was deliberate. She had said the words, but they weren't enough. She wanted the world to understand the truth. The prosecutor stepped forward cautiously. "Sweetheart," he said, kneeling slightly to be closer to her level, "can you tell us what happened?" The child's lips pressed together. A pause stretched, heavy and unbroken, before she spoke again. "Here," she said, pointing again. This time, her small finger trembling but unwavering at the defendant. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. The jurors leaned forward. The defendant stiffened so visibly that his suit jacket creaked under the pressure. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His defense attorney swallowed, panic flickering behind his eyes. This wasn't in any strategy or plan. The trial, which had been carefully scripted, had gone off the rails. The dog shifted slightly, lowering his head in response to the girl's gesture. His ears twitched. His nostrils flared faintly. Something primal stirred in him, the same instinct that had made him a skilled crime fighter. But now it was guided not by training, but by the intuition of a child. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Please proceed carefully," he instructed, though it was clear he was as unsettled as everyone else. The child's eyes darted to her mother again, seeking reassurance. The mother nodded subtly, her fingers brushing her daughter's small hand. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're helping people." Then the girl's voice grew stronger. "He took," she paused, her little chest rising and falling, eyes narrowing, "my toy." The courtroom fell silent once more. Some jurors suppressed giggles, thinking it a child's misunderstanding, but the dog's reaction was immediate. His body tensed. His eyes never left the defendant. The handler felt the surge of instinct again, a sensation he had experienced only in moments of genuine threat or recognition. The defendant's face blanched, his lips parted in disbelief. A faint tremor ran down his jaw. He leaned forward, trying to speak, but his words were caught in his throat. Every attempt at composure was failing. The prosecutor, sensing the shift, decided to proceed cautiously. "Can you show us where this happened?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. The child pointed again, this time sweeping her hand toward the front of the courtroom, her tiny fingers trembling with both fear and determination. The dog leaned slightly forward, ears pricked. He knew instinctively what was being indicated. The defense attorney tried to intervene. "Objection, this is leading the child, it's inadmissible," he shouted, voice sharp, eyes darting at the judge. The judge raised a hand, signaling silence. "Overruled," he said. "We will continue. The child's identification stands as a spontaneous declaration." The jurors leaned closer. Every officer present stiffened. Even the court reporter paused mid-stroke, pen hovering above paper, sensing history in the making. The child's words were tiny, almost whispered, but their effect rippled like shockwaves. "He did it," she said, pointing without hesitation. The defendant's face turned ashen. He shook his head weakly, opening his mouth to argue, but all sound seemed to evaporate. His defense attorney's face was pale, panic etched into every line. The mother tried to keep her composure, but she whispered under her breath, "Be strong, baby. You're helping them see." The dog's tail flicked once sharply. He stepped slightly closer, a silent affirmation of the child's identification. It was subtle, but anyone trained to watch could see it, he knew. The judge exhaled slowly, pushing his glasses higher on his nose. "We will allow the child's statement as testimony," he declared, voice heavy. "We will proceed with caution." The room seemed to hold its breath. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. A 3-year-old had just disrupted the carefully constructed order of the courtroom. A dog had responded instinctively. And the defendant, previously confident and composed, now sat frozen in fear, confronted by 2 unlikely witnesses, a child and a K-9 trained to see the truth. The prosecutor glanced at the jury, then back at the child. "Can you show us exactly what happened, sweetie?" The little girl nodded slightly, her eyes narrowed in concentration. Slowly, deliberately, she pointed again, her voice soft but firm. "Here." The courtroom didn't move. Every eye followed the line of her tiny arm. The defendant's hands shook. The dog's posture was rigid. Even the judge felt his stomach tighten. The moment stretched, fragile and electric. Something monumental had begun, and everyone, knowingly or unknowingly, was now waiting for what would happen next. The room had changed, permanently, and the child, small but fearless, had just begun to speak. The courtroom seemed to shrink with every heartbeat. The little girl's finger remained rigidly pointed at the defendant, her pink sneakers barely moving on the polished floor. Her lips trembled as if preparing to speak again, but now she seemed to measure the weight of every word. The jurors' faces reflected a mix of disbelief and fascination, their notebooks forgotten, cameras idle. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered above the keys. The judge's gavel rested unused. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Proceed," he said, though his voice betrayed a tremor of tension. No one had anticipated a 3-year-old would so fundamentally disrupt the decorum of the courtroom. The dog, a black blur of discipline and instinct, shifted slightly, ears pricked toward the child. His nose twitched as if sniffing the very air for hidden truths. The handler's jaw tightened. He had worked in law enforcement for years, seen criminals crumble under scrutiny, but nothing compared to this, the quiet, unshakable authority emanating from a 3-year-old girl. The mother bent down slightly, whispering reassurance, but her voice shook. "It's okay, sweetie, just tell them what you remember." The child inhaled slowly, her eyes locking on the defendant again. Then she spoke 2 words, barely above a whisper, but with the clarity and weight of judgment. "Police dog." Gasps echoed. Some jurors sat rigid, eyes wide. Others murmured to each other, unsure if they had heard correctly. The defendant's face drained of color. He leaned back slightly, mouth opening, then closing again as his voice failed him. "Objection," his lawyer shouted, trying to regain control. "This is highly prejudicial. She's nomming a police K-9 before any testimony has even been established." The judge's eyes, however, stayed on the child. "Sit down," he said sharply, signaling the lawyer to remain silent. "We will hear the child. This is a spontaneous identification." The prosecutor, sensing an opportunity, approached slowly, careful not to appear threatening. "Sweetheart," he said gently, kneeling to meet her eyes, "can you tell us what happened with the police dog?" The little girl's eyes flicked briefly to her mother, then back to the defendant. Her small hand trembled as she adjusted her grip on her stuffed rabbit, the one dangling from her arm. She drew a deep breath and spoke again, louder this time, the words deliberate and unmistakable. "Scared him." The courtroom froze. The dog, still seated, tilted his head slightly. The handler's grip on the harness tightened ever so slightly. He had seen dogs detect fear in countless situations, but to respond to the observation of a toddler, that was unprecedented. The defendant's jaw dropped, sweat beading on his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but the words never came. Every instinct he had told him that the child had just revealed a connection he could not deny. Jurors leaned forward, their attention rapt. Some exchanged glances of astonishment. The gallery was silent except for the occasional muffled sob of a family member who had come to watch the proceedings unfold. Even reporters were unusually still, capturing a moment of truth rather than routine testimony. The judge, unusually quiet, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Explain, young lady," he said softly, almost coaxing, "how the police dog made him scared." The girl's eyes narrowed, lips pressed together. Then she raised her arm, pointing directly at the defendant again. Her voice, firm and resolute, rang through the chamber. "He ran." The jurors gasped again. The defendant froze, white as chalk. His hands gripped the table edge, fingers clawing at the wood. The lawyer stammered, searching for words, but nothing seemed sufficient to counteract the child's simple, devastating observation. The dog's tail twitched sharply. A low, subtle growl vibrated through his chest, barely audible but unmistakable to anyone attuned. The handler's heart raced. He knew exactly what the dog was signaling, a criminal's fear, pure and undeniable. Even the prosecutor, seasoned and battle-hardened, felt the surge of adrenaline. The testimony was not just emotional, it was definitive. The child, through instinct and honesty, had begun dismantling the defendant's defenses. The mother reached forward instinctively, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. "You're doing so well," she whispered. "Just tell the truth." The girl blinked once, then spoke again, each word crystal clear. "Ran away." The defendant's entire body seemed to stiffen. He opened his mouth, trying to defend himself, but his voice came out as a strangled whisper. He leaned forward, as if the act of physically closing the gap might erase the accusation, but it did not. The courtroom was tense, vibrating with an almost tangible electricity. No one had expected a child's perspective, so raw, so simple, to pierce the carefully constructed layers of legal strategy. The jurors were leaning forward, faces pale, eyes wide. The judge's hand tapped lightly on the desk, barely controlling the weight of the moment. The dog, obedient yet fully aware, took another subtle step forward. His eyes remained fixed on the defendant, the air between them thick with instinctual understanding. The handler, normally the calm center of all K9 operations, felt his pulse accelerate. The mother whispered one last time, "You're safe, honey, just tell the truth." The girl drew a deep breath, pointing again with her small, trembling hand. "He was scared," she said. The jurors shifted in their seats. A reporter scribbled furiously. The courtroom felt as though it was teetering on the edge of revelation. Something monumental had just been set in motion, a truth that no argument, no objection, no legal maneuver could deny. And the defendant? He sat frozen, paralyzed by fear, by exposure, by the undeniable innocence of a child paired with the instinctive authority of a trained police dog. For the first time, everyone in the courtroom understood. The trial had changed forever. The next words would either unravel everything or confirm the impossible. The courtroom had transformed into a theater of raw, unfiltered truth. The little girl's repeated declarations, "Bad man," "He ran," "Scared him," had stripped away pretense, leaving everyone exposed to the weight of her observation. Silence hung like a thick curtain, broken only by the soft scrape of papers and the occasional click of a camera shutter. The jurors leaned forward, eyes wide and unblinking. For most of them, courtroom proceedings were routine, predictable, guided by logic and procedure. But nothing about this was routine. A 3-year-old had spoken, and her words carried the power of an indictment far sharper than any attorney's argument. The defendant sat frozen, sweat beading along his hairline. His suit, once perfectly pressed, now looked rigid, almost suffocating, as though it were constricting him under the weight of the courtroom's scrutiny. His knuckles were white from gripping the table, fingers trembling as he stared at the small figure in pink sneakers. Every instinct in his body screamed danger, but this wasn't about instinct. This was about truth. The dog's presence amplified it. He had shifted slightly closer, ears forward, tail still low but rigid. His keen senses were alert, scanning for subtle signs of fear. He didn't need to see evidence or hear testimony. He could feel it in the defendant's tension, smell it in the air, recognize it instinctively. The handler tightened his grip on the harness, aware that the canine's reaction was about to become part of the story in a way no one had ever anticipated. The prosecutor, sensing an opening, moved carefully forward. "Young lady," he said gently, keeping his voice steady, "can you tell us exactly what the man did?" The child's tiny eyes flicked to her mother for reassurance, then back to the defendant. Her mother nodded, fingers brushing the girl's hand. "Just tell the truth, honey," she whispered. "Everything you saw." The child's small chest rose and fell with determination. "He ran away," she said again, her voice louder, firmer, echoing slightly off the high courtroom walls. The room reacted instantly. Jurors shifted in their seats, leaning forward as though pulled by the gravity of her statement. The defendant's head jerked upward, his eyes widened in panic. The defense attorney's mouth opened and closed, searching for a strategy that no longer existed. The judge, whose gavel had been idle, tapped it lightly, his face betraying both disbelief and the effort to maintain control. "Order in the court," he commanded, but the words carried little authority now. The truth had a momentum that no gavel could halt. The child wasn't done. Her small hand shook slightly as she pointed at the defendant. "He tried to hide," she said, her words deliberate, her voice clear. The dog reacted instantly. His head tilted slightly, ears forward, tail flicking, subtle but unmistakable. He was confirming her words, acknowledging the fear he had sensed. The handler, heart racing, knew the dog had picked up on something the human mind could not fully grasp yet. The defendant's guilt was no longer just a suspicion. It was a palpable force. The defendant's face went pale. He leaned forward, grasping the edge of the table as though he could hold onto something solid in the midst of the unraveling storm. "This is nonsense," he finally shouted, his voice shaking. "A child doesn't know, she doesn't understand anything." The judge lifted a hand, silencing him. "Counselor, control your client," he said, his voice sharp but wary. Then, turning slightly toward the child, he added, "Proceed. Tell us what you remember." The child's gaze remained steady. Her voice, small but resolute, rose again. "He ran," she repeated. "He hid the dog he knew." A murmur spread across the courtroom. Jurors whispered among themselves, exchanging incredulous glances. The gallery sat rigid, hanging on every word. Even reporters paused, pens frozen above paper, capturing not just testimony but a moment of profound revelation. The prosecutor stepped closer, carefully framing his question. "Can you show us what he did when the police dog arrived?" The girl nodded, adjusting her stuffed rabbit in one arm. Then, with her tiny hand, she gestured toward the defendant's chair, pointing precisely to where he had been seated moments earlier. "He looked scared," she said, her voice unwavering. The dog responded instantly. He leaned forward slightly, tail flicking, ears high. It was as if he were validating her statement in a language only they shared, instinct and recognition. The handler exhaled slowly, aware that this moment would become legendary in his career. The defendant's hands shook visibly. His lawyer tried again to intervene, but the words faltered under the weight of the child's identification and the dog's undeniable response. For the first time, the strategy of denial seemed laughable, almost absurd. The mother, holding her breath, whispered softly to her daughter, "It's okay, baby, you're doing the right thing." The child's face, small and determined, reflected understanding beyond her years. "He was scared," she repeated. "The dog knew he ran." The judge, leaning forward, took a deep breath. "We will allow the child's statements as part of the record," he declared. "The court recognizes that this identification is spontaneous and compelling." The room seemed to vibrate with tension. The jurors were no longer passive observers. They were participants in a narrative unfolding in real time, guided by the words of a 3-year-old and validated by the instinct of a trained police dog. The defendant slumped slightly in his chair, white-knuckled hands gripping the table. He was trapped, not by evidence alone, but by truth, raw, simple, undeniable truth spoken through the innocence of a child. The prosecutor nodded slightly, eyes glinting with determination. The case was no longer just legal. It was human, visceral, immediate. And in that courtroom, everyone knew that the child's words, backed by instinct and observation, had just shifted the balance irreversibly. The next move would be critical. Every observer sensed it. The unraveling of the defense had begun. And at the center of it all, the little girl, pink sneakers squeaking softly, eyes unwavering, had already delivered a verdict far more powerful than any jury could write. The courtroom air felt thick, almost suffocating. Every person inside seemed suspended in anticipation, aware that something extraordinary was unfolding. A 3-year-old child and a police dog had just dismantled the defendant's carefully constructed veneer of composure, and no one knew what would happen next. The little girl's finger still pointed unwaveringly at the defendant, her pink sneakers pressed against the polished floor, her stuffed rabbit forgotten in her other arm. Her voice, soft but firm, had echoed through the chamber multiple times, each repetition peeling back another layer of deception. The jurors leaned forward, absorbing each word. Some pressed hands to their mouths, unable to conceal astonishment. Others simply stared, captivated by the raw simplicity of the child's truth. The defendant sat rigid, hands clutching the table. Sweat trickled down the side of his face, and his normally confident posture had collapsed into something small, vulnerable, almost pathetic. His defense attorney whispered rapidly, a desperate attempt to regain control, but his words were swallowed by the courtroom's electric tension. The child had spoken, and her words carried a weight no adult could contest. The prosecutor took a deliberate step forward. "Can you tell us what happened when the police dog arrived?" he asked gently, his voice measured. "What did you see?" The little girl's eyes flicked to her mother for reassurance. The mother nodded, brushing her fingers across her daughter's arm. "It's okay, just tell them what you saw." The child's lips pressed together, then parted as she spoke, clear and unwavering. "He ran, he hid, the dog knew." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, but no one interrupted. The judge's gavel remained untouched, even he sensed the extraordinary weight of the moment. The dog, still seated, reacted subtly but unmistakably. His tail flicked sharply, ears forward, head tilting just enough to signal recognition. To anyone watching closely, it was clear. The dog understood the child's identification. He validated it with instinct honed through years of rigorous police work. The handler's grip on the harness tightened, but he said nothing. He knew the dog's signals were as clear as any testimony, perhaps clearer. The defendant's face had drained completely of color. His lips parted, but he could not summon words. He tried to lean forward to explain, to protest, but the child's innocent observations and the dog's silent acknowledgement had trapped him. Every move he made seemed futile. The defense attorney's voice rose, sharp with panic. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly prejudicial. A child's words and the dog's reactions cannot be considered evidence." The judge adjusted his glasses, looking over the courtroom at the jurors, the child, and the dog. He spoke firmly, though with visible tension in his voice. "Overruled. The child's statements are spontaneous, clear, and directly relevant to the identification of the suspect. We will proceed." The jurors shifted in their seats. Some scribbled notes furiously, others simply stared, frozen. A few whispered quietly to each other, incredulous at what they were witnessing. The gallery, too, was silent, the room vibrating with anticipation. The prosecutor knelt slightly, bringing his voice down to a gentle, coaxing tone. "Can you show us what the man did when the police dog arrived?" The little girl nodded. Her small fingers trembled slightly as she pointed at the defendant's chair. Her voice rang out, clear and deliberate. "He was scared, he tried to hide." The dog reacted instantly, leaning forward subtly, ears pricked, tail stiff. His movements were small but precise, instinctively validating the child's observation. The handler felt his pulse spike. This was beyond ordinary courtroom procedure. The dog was not merely present, he was participating, reinforcing a truth that no argument could undo. The defendant's body stiffened. He shifted in his seat, attempting to regain composure, but each movement betrayed panic. His eyes darted to the child, then to the dog, and back to the floor. The room seemed to close in around him, the tension almost physical. The mother whispered softly, brushing a curl from her daughter's face. "You're safe, just tell the truth." The girl drew a deep breath, raising her tiny arm again. "He ran, he was scared, the dog knew." The jurors were leaning forward, riveted. Even the seasoned courtroom veterans felt the weight of what was happening. A child's words, paired with a K-9's instincts, had become irrefutable testimony. The judge leaned back slightly, tapping his fingers against the bench. "We will allow the child's statements into the record," he declared. "The court recognizes the identification as spontaneous and compelling." The defendant's hands trembled on the table. He slumped slightly, realizing his defenses were crumbling under the weight of two witnesses who could not lie or be coerced. The courtroom was electric with tension. Every observer knew that the trial had passed a point of no return. The child's testimony, amplified by the dog's instinctual recognition, had irreversibly shifted the balance. The next steps would be critical. Every witness, juror, and attorney sensed it. The unraveling of the defense had begun. And at the center of it all, the little girl, small and fearless, had already altered the course of the trial with her observations. Her innocence and clarity, coupled with the dog's silent but undeniable validation, had become the fulcrum of justice in that room. The defendant swallowed hard, trembling, fully aware that the truth had been exposed in a way he could not control. And as the gallery watched, the child's tiny words and the dog's instinctive presence had turned the courtroom into a stage where innocence and instinct held more power than any argument, evidence, or legal strategy. The courtroom had become a silent stage for a story no one could script. Every eye was fixed on the child, on the dog, and on the defendant, the three figures that had transformed a routine trial into a spectacle of truth. The air was thick with anticipation, so heavy it pressed against the walls, the ceiling, even the polished floor. Every breath felt measured, every movement amplified. The 3-year-old stood small but resolute, pink sneakers planted firmly. Her finger remained pointed, unwavering, as if it were an arrow of judgment aimed directly at the defendant. Her stuffed rabbit dangled limply from her arm, forgotten. She had spoken, repeated, clarified, and each time her words cut deeper, unraveling the carefully constructed defense. The dog, black and muscular, sat alert at the handler's side, his ears pricked, tail low but rigid. He had leaned forward subtly with each declaration, every twitch, every flick of his tail a silent corroboration of the child's testimony. The handler's hand rested lightly on the harness, more for reassurance than control. He had worked with countless K-9 units over his career, but nothing had prepared him for this, the instinct of the dog responding to a child's observation. The defendant's jaw was tight, lips pale, eyes darting frantically between the child and the dog. Every twitch of his muscles betrayed panic. His defense attorney whispered feverishly, but the man barely registered the words. His mind was consumed by the realization that the child and the dog had him trapped in a web he could not escape. The prosecutor leaned forward, voice gentle but firm. "Can you show the court exactly what happened, sweetie?" The child's eyes flicked briefly to her mother, who nodded silently. She adjusted her grip on the stuffed rabbit, then lifted her small hand and pointed deliberately toward the defendant. "He ran," she said. "He tried to hide, the dog knew." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The jurors leaned forward, some whispering to each other, but most simply watched in stunned silence. The defendant's body went rigid, his face drained of color. He attempted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The dog, responding instinctively, leaned slightly forward. A low, almost imperceptible growl vibrated in his chest, a canine confirmation of fear and guilt. The handler's pulse quickened. He had seen the dog detect weapons, drugs, explosives, and criminals in panic. But this was different. It was recognition combined with validation, an instinctual response that human testimony could never fully replicate. The judge adjusted his glasses, taking a slow, deliberate breath. "We will allow the child's statements into the record," he declared, his voice steady but layered with gravity. "The court recognizes the identification as spontaneous and compelling." The gallery was silent, the weight of the moment pressing on every person inside. Even seasoned reporters and courtroom staff exchanged glances of disbelief. A 3-year-old and a dog had become the center of a legal storm, their untrained honesty more powerful than any cross-examination, any lawyer's argument, any document or exhibit. The child's eyes narrowed slightly. She drew a deep breath, pointing again. He was scared, the dog knew. The defendant's hands shook. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward as though trying to physically erase the accusation, but it was futile. Every instinct, every piece of evidence, every observation, even a child's and a dog's perception, had cornered him. The prosecutor spoke again, this time calm, precise, measured. "Can you tell the court what he did when the police dog arrived?" The child's voice was small but firm. "He tried to hide." The dog responded instantly, stepping slightly forward, tail flicking, ears pricked. It was as if he were confirming the child's words with every movement. The handler's heart raced. He had never witnessed anything like this. A toddler's words, a dog's instinct, and the visible fear of an adult colliding in a courtroom in real time. The jurors leaned forward, absorbed. The gallery was tense, every whisper suppressed, every movement careful. The courtroom had become a stage for raw truth, instinctual, innocent, undeniable. The defendant's lawyer finally rose, voice trembling. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A child and a dog cannot testify. This is. The judge cut him off, voice sharp. "Sit down. The court recognizes the identification as spontaneous. The testimony is admissible. We proceed." The defendant's shoulders slumped slightly. His face was pale, and his jaw trembled. Every legal maneuver, every strategy he had counted on, was crumbling in the presence of two witnesses who could not lie. The prosecutor's eyes met the jurors. He spoke softly, deliberately, letting the weight of the child's testimony resonate. "Ladies and gentlemen, the child has seen what no one else could. Her observation, corroborated by trained instinct, exposes the truth. The defendant's fear, his reaction, his attempt to hide, all of it has been witnessed, noted, and confirmed. The dog's tail flicked again, a subtle but unmistakable sign of affirmation. His eyes remained on the defendant, unyielding. The handler's grip on the harness tightened. The defendant's breathing was shallow, panicked. He leaned back in his chair, white-knuckled hands gripping the edge. The gallery watched in silence, the air vibrating with tension. It was a moment frozen in time, where innocence and instinct held more power than any legal argument, more than any courtroom procedure. The child drew a deep breath. He was scared, she said again. The dog knew he ran. The courtroom was utterly still. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the judge's gavel, a symbol of authority, remained untouched. For a brief, suspended moment, the entire room existed solely in that intersection of fear, innocence, and instinct. Then slowly, as the words sank in, a realization dawned across the jurors' faces. The defendant's carefully constructed defenses had failed. He could deny evidence, argue procedure, claim misunderstanding. But he could not escape the truth recognized by a child and validated by a K-9 trained to sense it. The next move, they all knew, would be decisive. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for the final act, the last revelation that would tip the scales irrevocably. And at the center of it all, the child and the dog remained poised, small and silent yet impossibly powerful. The courtroom was still. The air was thick with tension, each heartbeat echoing like a drum in the silence. Every eye was on the 3-year-old girl in her pink dress and the black police dog at the front of the room. Together, they had dismantled the defense's facade piece by piece, their combined presence more powerful than any argument, any evidence, any legal maneuver. The defendant sat frozen, his body rigid, eyes wide. Sweat streaked his pale face. He gripped the edge of the table as though he could anchor himself to reality, but reality had shifted. The child's words and the dog's instincts had exposed something undeniable: fear, guilt, and a truth he could not escape. The jurors leaned forward, collectively holding their breath. They had witnessed something extraordinary. A child, barely speaking in complete sentences, had observed and identified a man's fear. A trained police dog had confirmed it with every subtle gesture, a tilt of the head, a flick of the tail, a measured shift in stance. No one could fabricate such instinctual honesty. The judge's gavel hovered untouched. His eyes scanned the courtroom, resting briefly on the child, then the dog, then the defendant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice firm but layered with gravity, "you have heard the testimony and observed the identification firsthand. You may now deliberate." A murmur ran through the gallery, quickly hushed by the judge's stern glance. The jurors rose slowly, their chairs scraping lightly against the floor, and filed into the deliberation room. Every movement was deliberate, weighed by the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Outside, the gallery remained tense, spectators frozen in anticipation, reporters scribbling furiously. The defendant slumped in his chair, head in hands, whispering something inaudible. His lawyer hovered beside him, muttering reassurances, but they both knew the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The child's words, backed by the dog's instincts, had changed everything. The mother crouched beside her daughter, brushing a curl from her face. "You did it, baby," she whispered softly. "You told the truth." The little girl blinked, absorbing the words, but her eyes never left the defendant. Her tiny body radiated both courage and certainty. She had witnessed fear and truth in its rawest form. She had spoken, and the courtroom had listened. The dog, obedient but alert, remained at attention. He had sensed what was happening long before anyone else. Every instinct, every learned response, every subtle signal had confirmed the child's observations. For the dog, there was no doubt. The defendant's fear was real, his guilt was present. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The gallery remained silent, the tension almost unbearable. Then, finally, the jury returned. The room seemed to grow heavier, the weight of their decision pressing on every person inside. They filed slowly to their seats, faces solemn, expressions unreadable. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict envelope tightly. The judge gestured for silence. Every breath seemed amplified in the stillness. The defendant straightened slightly, eyes fixed on the envelope. His hands shook, gripping the table as if trying to hold back what he knew was inevitable. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, voice steady but heavy with tension. The judge nodded, motioning for the envelope. He tore it open slowly, the paper crackling in the silence. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words. Then, in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of the courtroom itself, he spoke. "Guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The defendant's body went rigid. His eyes widened in disbelief, mouth opening and closing as he tried to form words, but none came. He slumped slightly, the finality of the moment sinking in. The jurors released a long, silent exhale, the tension breaking at last. Some exchanged glances of relief, others of quiet satisfaction. The gallery erupted softly into whispers, some tears, some stunned awe. The prosecutors allowed themselves small, controlled smiles. Justice had been served, though in a way no one could have anticipated. The mother bent down to her daughter, hugging her tightly. "You were so brave," she whispered, tears running down her cheeks. "You told the truth, and it mattered." The child hugged back tightly, eyes glistening. "The dog knew," she murmured, small but certain. "He knew he was scared." The dog, still at attention, gave a faint wag of his tail, almost imperceptible but full of acknowledgement. His dark eyes met the child's briefly, as if affirming that together they had revealed what words alone could not. The handler placed a hand gently on the dog's back, a quiet nod of respect passing between them. The defendant was led away, his face pale, his posture defeated. He glanced briefly at the child and the dog, a flicker of fear and recognition passing through his eyes. The courtroom watched silently, the gravity of the moment lingering. The judge called the courtroom to order, his gavel striking firmly. "This trial is concluded." Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, but the story had already been told. The narrative would be replayed countless times. A 3-year-old girl, a police dog, and 2 words that shattered a defense and revealed the truth. For the mother and daughter, there was relief, pride, and exhaustion. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and the weight of justice, yet the child's courage had made all the difference. For the dog and his handler, it was a quiet victory, instinct and training validated in the most extraordinary way. And for the defendant, it was a moment that would haunt him forever. The courtroom had witnessed innocence and instinct exposed truth in its purest form, leaving him powerless, exposed, and undeniably guilty. In that courtroom, on that ordinary morning turned extraordinary, a 3-year-old's words, simple, direct, and honest, had done what no legal strategy could. They had revealed the truth. The trial ended. Justice had prevailed, and everyone who had witnessed it knew they had seen something remarkable. A small child and a police dog together, exposing fear and guilt in a way the world would never forget. The end.